Hello and welcome to LDA's webinar today on the documentation disconnect. My name is Erica. I'm with the LDA of America staff, and I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping items before I introduce our speakers. If you're joining us today via webinar, great, not a problem. Have fun, enjoy the slides. There's a Q&A button on the bottom. If you have questions for our presenters, please put your questions in the Q&A section. We will get to them at the end of the presentation. I will be asking them to our presenters. If you are joining us via phone, please enter *9 to raise your hand at the end of the presentation to ask a question, and I will unmute you. Please be aware that if you're on speakerphone and you've asked to be unmuted, that I need you to take yourself off speakerphone before I unmute you, so we don't have a lot of feedback when we answer your questions. That being said, I'd like to introduce both Joanna Barnes. Joanna is the co-chair of our Public Policy Advocacy Committee, and Monica McHale-Small, who's the first vice president of LDA America's board. And take it away, Monica.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being with us. We want to get a little sense of who is with us today, so you will find a poll question. Up there it is. It popped right up there. So if you could let us know if your affiliation is with a public school or a private school, that would be helpful to us. And with that, we are going to launch into our presentation today.
So hello, I'm Joanna Barnes. I'm trying to get this off my screen, the poll question. Today's topic is the documentation disconnect. And the question is, why is it important that there be documentation for individuals, particularly students with learning disabilities? And it comes down to two very, very important things. The first is identification, because with identification, you can have instruction and accommodations in order to get your education. The second part is that learning disability diagnosis, which would include the documentation, is needed to qualify or be approved for services in school and accommodations for testing for colleges and in the workplace, and for high stakes tests like the SAT. We here at LDA use the term learning disability, and as you see bolded at the bottom, until a learning difference is recognized as an official diagnosis, we need to all get comfortable using the term learning disability. So let's move to the next slide. LDA has recently done last year a core principle on what are learning disabilities, and that's available on our website. But the primary elements of it is that it's a neurologically based processing disorder. It may impact an individual's ability to process, store, or produce information. It may impact one's ability to read, write, and spell, compute of reason, and can have co-occurring challenges. And if you're on this call, there's a pretty good chance that you're already familiar with that. I want to return to the first element, though, because that's crucial as we go forward in the rest of the discussion this afternoon. LDA's position is that, and belief is, that learning disabilities are neurologically based processing disorders. Next slide.
Oops. Oops, sorry, hold on.
It's okay.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. This comes from our website. These are examples of specific learning disabilities. And again, I think if you're on this call, you probably are aware of these many different examples. Dyslexia is what my two children have. There's also dyspraxia, dyscalculia, which is math. It covers a wide range of examples of syndromes, of disorders. Next one. The second core principle that LDA worked on, and we've adopted, is the core principle on evaluations and identification. And what this is what LDA, after consulting with experts and reviewing the literature, seeing where the research is going, is what LDA determines should be in an evaluation and then the identification for a learning disability. So in that paper, you will find what we set out to be the truly comprehensive evaluation of an individual's suspected learning disability. And that just doesn't apply to public schools. That would be all students, but this is what we'd like to see done in all the public schools. The first step of advocating for an individual with a learning disability is early identification. And of course, there's no identification without a comprehensive and thorough evaluation. We at LDA take the position, as we'll go forward, and Monica will discuss the methods of evaluation. We strongly emphasize one method. However, the federal law, we'll get into this in a little bit, allows different methods. It gives flexibility to the state to decide which methods they're going to employ for evaluation in order to get the information to determine if the criteria is met for the identification. That is actually in line with the definition. The IDEA definition of specific learning disability specifically says psychological processes and refers to imperfect ability to listen, speak, read, spell, mathematical calculations. Next slide. And I think that's you, Monica.
Okay. Hi,
Monica
everyone.
has her PhD in psychology, so she's the one who knows how to do this.
Okay, so as Joanna already said, we wrote a core principle which really details what we believe and what we endorse at LDA as far as evaluation and identification. And our position is that, and I want to say it's more than a belief, it's a position, because our position is based on research, that we must always start with a detailed developmental history. We need to understand the child's own language development and pre-reading skills and pre-math skills. We need information about the acquisition of language and academic skills of the individual's family members. And we need medical information from the parent or school to make differential diagnoses and make sure that a child's learning struggles are not the result of hearing, vision, or motor difficulties. When we're evaluating, we need to consider multiple sources of data. We need standardized norm reference assessment of cognitive ability and academic achievement. We need that progress monitoring data that comes from response to intervention systems, where we are looking at a child's response to evidence-based interventions. Of course, our evaluation process pertains to not just children, all individuals. So RTI and progress monitoring data would only be available in a school setting. We also need to look at teacher design and curriculum-based assessments, and we need input and observations from the parent and the teacher and from the student themselves. We need to be asking students and individuals who struggle with learning disabilities what they have difficulty with and what they see as their strengths and their challenges. Our position at LDA, and we believe our position is backed by much research in neuroscience and educational psychology, but we assert that cognitive processes associated with academic skills must be assessed. Oops. The research is increasing all the time to really help us to understand that while an overall IQ score may be limited in its ability to predict an individual's expected reading or math or writing level, we do know that specific cognitive abilities such as working memory, retrieval fluency, orthographic and auditory processing, visual and spatial processing, processing speed, fluid reasoning, and verbal abilities, all these things impact different academic skills differentially. And when children or individuals are being assessed for learning disabilities, we need to look at all of these different skills. The academic input or impact of the potential learning disability really has to be considered in context. Academic demands vary across educational settings and across the lifespan. So while a person may be successful in one setting or at one time in their life, things could change when the demands of that context change. For example, in many K-12 classrooms now, there isn't a real emphasis on speeded test or time test, but in other settings, especially in high stakes settings, there could be an emphasis on time test. So an individual's need for support and the type of support will definitely vary based on the demands of the learning environment, and that needs to be taken into consideration when an evaluation is being conducted.
So I'm going to return to the threshold question is, why are we on this call today? And it's the documentation disconnect. And just to realize what Monica's just gone through, I hope none of you zoned out, but it's very important because that is what's required to be in the documentation to make an evaluation of whether an individual has a learning disability. So we get to this next slide where we want to make clear underachievement, academic underachievement is a symptom of the presence of a learning disability, but is not synonymous with a learning disability. So if you have a student in a public school who's underachieving, you need to know more than that to determine if the student has a learning disability. Next slide. What you need to know are the cognitive and processing deficits, and that's what Monica's just described, is what you're looking for to determine or ascertain those cognitive processing deficits. And I love this term here, deficits impair one's acquisition of skills and ability to navigate learning and or performance. Impair, I think, is a much more precise word for what a learning disability is than imperfect, because we're all imperfect. But again, returning to what Monica just gave us through, the laundry list, that laundry list has to be gone through in order to determine the cognitive processing deficits. And think of that as we go through this documentation disconnect. Is that available to every student in a public school today?
Whoops. Okay. So why is documentation important? Okay, so documentation from evaluation is what will ultimately lead to identification, and identification will determine what a child has access to in terms of accommodations, modifications, specially designed instruction, and it will determine that not just in the K-12 setting, but also in college and higher education for high-stakes testing, and also workplace accommodations. So documentation is critical to access. Okay, how do students in public schools get evaluated or identified? I've kind of lost track of which slides I'm doing, so Joanna, if I'm moving in on your territory, please let me know.
Nope, you're good.
Okay, so the obligation for public schools is the onus is on the public school for identifying students with disabilities. So the state sets forth criteria, but the local education agency, which means the public school district or the charter school, must find those children who potentially have disabilities and then evaluate them to make sure that their needs are being met. And that is known as child find. So public schools must have systems in place to ensure that individuals with disabilities are identified early and are fully supported. And this includes all suspected disabilities, not just learning disabilities. So public schools are obligated to initiate evaluations, and they should not be waiting until a parent makes a request and sees their child struggling. Public schools have that responsibility to initiate the evaluation when they see that the child is starting to fall behind or struggle. Right now in IDEA, in federal law, there are 3 different methods of evaluation that are used, and it's in the law, but this is also in practice. So ability achievement discrepancy is the one that has pretty much been in the law since 1975 from the beginning. And in this method, the evaluator considers the individual's academic skills in relationship to the individual's overall cognitive ability or IQ score. A learning disability is diagnosed when academic skills measure significantly below expectations given the individual's overall cognitive functioning. Another method of evaluation, which is used and is spelled out in a number of states, including California and Oregon, is what's known as PSW methods, or patterns of strengths and weaknesses. In IDEA, this methodology would fall under the category of other alternative research-based procedure. PSW models are different than ability achievement models in that cognitive processes that are most relevant to the academic skills are assessed, and a learning disability is diagnosed when an individual demonstrates a pattern of cognitive processing strengths and weaknesses and academic deficits that are consistent with that pattern. For example, children with dyslexia, We know that dyslexia has its root in phonological processing deficits and also in rapid automatized naming. So what we would be looking at there is not so much the overall cognitive ability of the child, the full scale IQ score, but does this individual have a number of cognitive skills that are average or better, but they have those processing deficits that would go along with the diagnosis of dyslexia or basic reading learning disability, which would be phonological processing, orthographic processing, rapid automatized naming, working memory, etc. And then the third method, and this was added to IDEA in 2004, is response to intervention. In this method, the evaluation considers the individual's response to evidence-based intervention that is targeted to the child's demonstrated academic needs. So if a child is struggling with basic reading skills, then they would receive intervention that targets those skills, and their response to that intervention would be monitored. In this method, a learning disability is diagnosed when an individual fails to respond adequately or as expected to that intervention. Okay, so what we do know from the research and from practice is that these different methods identify different types of students. With ability achievement discrepancy, this method typically identifies students with average or better overall cognitive ability and below average academic skills. In this method, processing skills are not typically identified. Students with low or below average overall cognitive ability are often not identified because their skills, their academic skills, are viewed as commensurate with their overall abilities. And this method does not consider that overall cognitive scores are sometimes impacted by specific processing deficits. For example, an overall IQ score is really a weighted average of all the different subskills that are assessed. So if an individual has some working memory deficits, that's going to pull down the overall IQ score, and it's not necessarily representative of that child's academic potential and cognitive potential. And what exactly constitutes a significant or severe discrepancy varies from state to state and sometimes across school districts. So it's not unusual at all that in states that use this method, different children or the same child might qualify as learning disabled in one school district, but not in a neighboring school district because of, or not in one state, but not in a neighboring state. So that is problematic. With PSW, or patterns of strengths and weaknesses, this model is based on the assumption that learning disabilities are neurologically based. Like ability achievement discrepancy models, PSW models investigate underachievement that is unexpected given the individual's otherwise average or typical cognitive abilities. So these are individuals that in many ways are very bright and capable, but they struggle with certain processing skills like working memory or processing speed or maybe fluid reasoning. Unlike ability achievement discrepancy models, PSW models recognize that there are numerous cognitive abilities and processing skills are assessed discretely. So we look at these different cognitive processing abilities that we know differentially impact academic performance, and we assess all of those. We recognize that cognitive processing weaknesses will impact achievement, and they may also result in a composite IQ score that underestimates that individual's potential, which is what I noted on that last slide. Neurocognitive research is only beginning to understand how cognitive processing abilities are best measured and how they impact academics, but our tests are getting better all the time, and we can assess these different domains of cognitive functioning with very high levels of reliability. And then finally, RTI methods. This method typically identifies students who are at the lower end of the academic skill distribution. Cognitive abilities are not a factor other than to rule out intellectual disability. Processing skills are not directly assessed in these models. There is little research to suggest what criteria should be used to determine when an individual has or has not made adequate response to intervention. And then finally, a big problem that we see at LDA with RTI models is that many schools and districts lack the resources to provide the training and the materials to implement RTI models with fidelity.
So this is, I'll take over this next two slides because this actually, I'll be doing North Carolina too. Are we doing North Carolina?
Oh, no, I took North Carolina out just because we're
okay.
If
Well,
we
I
have
will
time
mention
at the end.
briefly as we go into this. So I'm always bashing this urban myth with the old guard, people who've been in learning disabilities for a while. There's this idea, well, a comprehensive evaluation for LD, IDEA requires cognitive assessment. No, it doesn't. If you look at the statute, it says conduct of the evaluation is, I need to move it so I can read the whole screen, this is important. Use technically sound instruments that may assess the relative contribution of cognitive and behavioral factors. So you have to say the relative contribution of cognitive factors. So relative means standing or some relation to. If you believe that there is no cognitive factor in a learning disability, then you don't do any testing for it. And there are many categories in IDEA where cognitive testing is not done. Other health impaired, orthopedic, and in North Carolina it includes deaf, which I've always found interesting. There's one or two other categories. Next slide. And what has happened is in North Carolina, for instance, and they took these up, this has been part of the presentation, is North Carolina no longer will use any cognitive assessments as part of an evaluation for a learning disability because they have taken the position that only RTI can be used because there's no cognitive factors in a learning disability. When I mention to people, well, Melanie Musgrove's memo says that RTI can't be used to deny or delay, it does say that. What it also says, besides RTI cannot delay an evaluation for eligibility, it also says, Musgrove's memo, is RTI can be the method of evaluation for eligibility. So there's this idea is like, well, when you're going through RTI, you can still request a comprehensive evaluation. And people think that means they're kind of cognitive assessments. Not in a state which is now using RTI as the sole method of evaluation. RTI is the method. When they refer to comprehensive evaluation with RTI, the other elements being evaluated in that comprehensive evaluation are what we're familiar with: vision, hearing, the exclusionary factors about tardiness, illness, things like that. So again, we're returning to the documentation disconnect. If you are in a school district or a state which uses RTI as the sole method of evaluation, what you are getting to show your learning, that you're learning, have a learning disability, is only the RTI reports. Next slide. Monica?
Okay, so back in April of this year, there was a report by the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, that looked at the child fine practices in special education. And they concluded that the varied state criteria for identification of students with disabilities, and this was all disabilities, not just learning disabilities, but they concluded that these varied criteria that states are using may contribute to differences in the percentage of children that are served through special education. Okay. And what the report also concluded, which is very important, is that the federal oversight has been inadequate, and that inadequate federal oversight has led to inconsistent state policies and practices, which are resulting in a failure to identify children and infants and toddlers with disabilities. Okay, so they have found that the child fine policies at the state level are too varied and too inconsistent. So despite research that suggests that the percentage of children identified, hold on one second, identified with disabilities, it continues to be constant throughout the country and has remained steady for a number of years. The percentage of children aged 6 to 21 who receive special education services differs from state to state. So to kind of reiterate that. So overall, we have no evidence that the numbers of children with disabilities who are potentially eligible under IDEA has decreased. But when you look from state to state, you see wide ranges in the percentage of children who are identified and serviced under the IDEA. And that percentage in this report that really looked at only 4 states ranged from 6.4 to 15.1%. So there's wide variation, and this is problematic. So the GAO report reveals how the combination of inconsistent policies and inadequate federal oversight continues to allow thousands of young people with disabilities to fall through the cracks. Early and accurate identification and evidence-based interventions can make a huge difference in the lives of children, families, and communities across this country. So that was a quote by Senator Bobby Scott, who chaired the committee that asked for this report. And I think that that statement really sums up what we have seen at LDA and what we hear from parents and what we've been collecting in stories through a child find survey that we have out there.
So I'm going to jump in just for a second, Monica, as you go through this, but I keep returning to what this talk is about today. It's the documentation disconnect. And the primary purpose of our talk is to really set out just what the GAO report has actually brought out is it's a Wild West show out there, and there's not consistency in documentation, evaluations, and identification. And that's the purpose of today's talk, is to lay out the problem, and then we'll make a recommended solution. Go ahead, Monica.
Okay, so as Joanna is saying, if learning disabilities are neurologically based, right? They should not exist and then disappear if a child moves from a school district to another school district or from one state to another. They may manifest differently depending on the educational context, but they don't disappear. So this is problematic that we see such inconsistency. So the major findings of this GAO report, and you can find this out there online, is first under identification, that appropriately identifying and evaluating children who may be eligible for special education services can be difficult, and that's true. We know that there are challenges and there's not 100% agreement on the criteria and the nuances around identifications, but because of this, differences in school districts, in school special education processes adds to this challenge even more. So there is not 100% agreement in the field as far as identification and evaluation, but the inconsistencies with what school districts are doing and how states are interpreting guidelines and their oversight or lack of oversight makes this problem even more challenging. With English language learners, English language learning students are at risk of being both over and under identified, and clearly much more training and resources are needed in this area for educators. And then RTI challenges, just like we've talked about and what we hear from parents at LDA, there are challenges around child find and early and accurate identification that stem from RTI. So representatives from advocacy organizations in all 4 states that were visited by the GAO cited concerns with school RTI practices that may delay student evaluations or contribute to incorrect eligibility determinations. School district officials in all states visited, so these are the school district officials themselves, acknowledged that the quality of RTI implementation varied within their school district. So in this situation, in this case, the school officials were not just saying that there's variation from school district to school district, but they were acknowledging that even within their school district, from one school to another, the validity and the fidelity of the process will be different. And that is very problematic if we're going to ensure that all children with disabilities are identified early and evaluated fully. So federal oversight overemphasizes right now adherence to timelines rather than effective systems to identify the students who need services. So as I mentioned, LDA has done a child find survey, and our survey really supports the findings of the GAO. And what we have here are some quotes from parents, and it just underscores the idea that parents are continuing to struggle to get their children identified, appropriately evaluated and identified early. In this first parent, who is from Virginia, says, my concern is that having went through this process a couple of times, children will fall through the cracks if a state is not held accountable to actively search for signs of disability. Early intervention is key, and these children, to move this, will be at a preventable deficit if a state doesn't want to make more work for themselves. So what the parent there from Virginia is saying is just what the GAO found, is that there is not good oversight by the states and by the federal government to ensure that school districts aren't just meeting timelines, but they actually have effective processes to find children who are truly disabled and learning disabled and who need early intervention. Another parent from Florida was repeatedly told that their child had ADHD and that they should place their child on medication. She started expressing her concerns about a possible learning disability when her child was in kindergarten, and she shared that she was fearful that her child had dyslexia. Each teacher that she encountered told this parent that her child would grow out of it, and finally she had an evaluation in second grade when signs of LD became very evident, and also had a private evaluation because she became tired of waiting for the school to do it. And we hear that from many parents, and that's not how it should work. Public schools are obligated to do this evaluation, but many parents are finding that they have to go out of the school system and get an evaluation privately, which is a huge expense, and which many parents who are low SES cannot possibly afford to do for their children. So children are getting left behind because of this. Okay, and this is just another couple of stories. This is a story about a child who had dyslexia. The result of the evaluation showed that she had difficulty in reading, writing, and spelling, but this discrepancy was not large enough for her to qualify. So again, that goes back to what we talked about earlier, that when you have different evaluation methods, some children are not getting picked up as quickly as they should be. And in this situation, this child was reevaluated in fourth grade and then qualified. So, there were several years of education and intervention that were lost to that child because of the method of identification that was being utilized. Another parent from Indiana talked about that it was very evident that their child was not making progress in reading and writing, and they requested an evaluation before the end of first grade, and were told by the teacher that they did not think that their child would qualify. And sure enough, after pushing, eventually this parent had to go and remediate the child himself and get an outside evaluation, which again, school districts are supposed to be doing this for parents. Okay, Joanna.
I think I actually just went into this.
We are, so we can skip this.
Yeah, you can skip that.
Okay. Okay, so also, just like Joanna said, and we talked about, RTI continues to be a barrier, and we found a number of parents, and I won't take the time to read each one of these slides, but we found parents from many different states that talk about how the referral process and the RTI process has essentially delayed the evaluation of their child, or their child was not able to get an evaluation because they hadn't gone through the entirety of the evaluation process. Is there anything you want to add about this slide, Joanna?
No, just to not confuse, where RTI is a process to collect data as part of a comprehensive evaluation that will include some cognitive testing, versus when RTI is the sole method of evaluation. So this is, it's still not clear how RTI, if you're not done with it yet, and it's the sole method of evaluation, can be a comprehensive evaluation. Right. But you have at any point in a child's education, you can request a comprehensive evaluation, and they have to do something.
Right. So parents, and like Joanna said, the parent can request this, but what we found in the responses that many parents gave us through our survey is that parents are being told that no, they must wait until the whole process is over, which is clearly contradictory to what the law says. Okay, so many students who could be helped through early and intensive intervention are not evaluated until they have already experienced that academic failure, and sometimes they languish in RTI. And kids, we saw a number of situations where children were in RTI for several years before they were finally evaluated. So in many ways, RTI has become another wait to fail model for students with learning disabilities, and we do not, at LDA, we do not believe it should be used as a substitution for an evaluation. Many children in RTI models who have learning disabilities, who have those cognitive processing deficits and whose academic skills are impaired, do not meet the eligibility requirement when RTI is used as the method of evaluation. Because again, those models tend to identify the kids who are at the lowest end of the achievement continuum. Okay. Individuals who are educated outside of the public school system are not, I'm not quite sure why we have, okay, this is another barrier that we have to beat. A lot of parents get frustrated and they remove their children from public school because they're not experiencing the success, or the school is not evaluating their child. But parents have to be mindful of the fact that when children are educated outside of the public schools, they do not have that specialized support or protection that is guaranteed to them under the IDEA. So what we have found through our survey and through our interactions with parents is that far too many children and young adults are left undiagnosed, or they are not diagnosed early enough in order to attain the adequate services and support that will enhance their educational and career success. So we have just had more and more, I feel like we're just kind of pounding you with more and more examples, but we have two other examples of parents sharing with us that their child, they started to mention difficulties in kindergarten, but the school didn't identify him until 5th grade. So again, he had many years without service, and that will surely impact his long-term success. Another parent here who had to go for an outside evaluation. And now we're going to go back to our discussion about why this documentation is so important and why we're harping on this whole idea that schools are not always successful in their obligations under the IDEA in terms of child find. Because without the proper evaluation, without the proper identification and documentation, children do not have access to IEPs and 504s that will enhance their educational experience. They will not have access to college accommodations or accommodations in high stakes testing in the workplace. So what we know is that, and some of you might remember the Varsity Blues scandal. Part of that scandal was that some of the students or some of the families had their student evaluated for learning disabilities or other disabilities in order to receive extra time on testing. We don't know for sure which of those individuals may truly have had learning disabilities, and we don't know the individual circumstances. But what we do know is that there was quite a lot of attention paid to this issue after that scandal. And there were a number of different articles, and one in the Wall Street Journal was very interesting because it really underscored the idea that affluent students are much more likely to get extra time on the SAT and are much more likely to have 504 plans that give them those accommodations. So in the one Wall Street Journal article, they looked at public schools and they found in wealthier areas where no more than 10% of the students were eligible for free and reduced lunch, they had very high percentages of those students getting accommodations, okay? Whereas in lower income students, very few of those, in lower income school districts, very few students were getting those 504 plans and those accommodations. So there's a clear disparity in who is getting those accommodations, and that we believe is largely because parents in more affluent school districts have more access to getting private evaluations. They also are more likely to have people that will help them understand what their rights are and to get those evaluations that their children are entitled to. And individual students who are attending lower income school districts and more poorly resourced school districts are less likely to get those accommodations and evaluations that they are entitled to under the law.
So Monica, I'll just return to what this talk is about, the documentation disconnect. This is an opinion of mine, but I think this is what we're talking about, is we don't know if all those students who were in a poorly resourced school had access to the quality of evaluations that are in the wealthier area. How many of those students would actually get accommodations and be found learning disabled? Is this a function that there's a documentation disconnect, that they don't have access to the quality evaluations needed to be identified as having a learning disability and then get accommodations on these tests?
Right. And that's certainly what the data is suggesting when you look at the rates of disability. It just doesn't make sense that there would be less kids with qualifying disabilities in lower income school districts. There's no good neurological basis to suggest that that might be the case. And in fact, what we believe is that the parents in the more highly resourced school districts simply have more access to their knowledge of their rights and also to ensuring that their child has proper evaluation. So one of the important things, and this goes back to that whole Varsity Blues scandal, that what some of those parents were after was ensuring that their children were given accommodations for high stakes testing, for College Board SAT testing. And, again, some of those students may have had true learning disabilities and truly have been entitled to those accommodations. We don't know that for sure, but our position at LDA is we want to make sure that every child who needs those accommodations and who are entitled to those accommodations get those accommodations. And we have serious concerns about whether or not that will be the case for children who are in school districts that use RTI only, or who are in generally under-resourced school districts where perhaps not every child who needs an evaluation is getting a timely and early evaluation. So the College Board has 7 documentation criteria for individuals who are applying for consideration for accommodations. And when in looking at these criteria, we can say that our core principle on evaluation and identification that LDA has is very much consistent with what the College Board criteria is. That there is a diagnosis that's clearly stated, that the information in the evaluation is current, that the educationally relevant developmental and medical history is presented, that the diagnosis is supported through formal and informal assessment, that the functional limitation is described, that the recommended accommodations are justified, and that the evaluator's professional credentials are established. So all these things are what the College Board require for children to get accommodations on the SAT and other high stakes tests. And this is very much consistent with LDA's position on what constitutes a truly comprehensive evaluation for identification with a possible learning disability. So just to go into a little bit more of that, so in the criteria that the College Board spells out is that there must be a summary of assessment procedures and evaluation instruments used, that there has to be a narrative that explains those assessments, and that the test results and subtest scores must be reported as standard scores or scaled scores. In an RTI only method, standard subtest scores do not exist because standardized norm reference assessment is not part of that model of identification. The College Board also talks about the tests used to diagnose learning disorders should be comprehensive cognitive and academic assessments. Again, RTI models do not use cognitive assessment, that these assessments must be individually administered, nationally normed, and administered under standardized conditions. all of those things do not apply to an RTI model. And in addition, the testing should include both timed and untimed standardized measured if in fact that one of the accommodations that's being requested is extended time, and also look at the measure of symptom validity, right? So how does this individual's disability impact them in the educational environment? Okay, Joanna, do you want to take
Yeah,
that?
I think we're coming up on time. We'll just mention that the documentation is going to be needed later if an individual is looking to have any accommodations in the workplace under the ADA. You need it after college, after high school. That's pretty much it. Next one.
Okay. So where are we now? Where we are is that despite, what we recognize as best practice, despite what we know about the nature of learning disabilities, many individuals are only identified after years of failure and accumulation of emotional damage and social stigma. So in other words, we're not where we need to be. So recommendations are that what we at LDA endorse is that we need to educate teachers at the university level on the evaluation, identification, and documentation of learning disabilities and related disorders. We need to utilize evidence-based instructional methods in our classrooms. We need to teach students to advocate for themselves early and often. And we need to support the efforts of organizations like LDA and our state affiliates, because this is the work that we're doing. We're working hard to ensure that all students get the evaluation and the documentation that they need to access their fullest potential. Okay, so Joanna, why don't you take this one?
The big takeaway, at this point, failure is a requirement for identification in the public schools. This presentation had more about RTI, but RTI is failure to respond to RTI is how you're identified. It also is, we didn't go into the eligibility requirements under IDEA, but the first test is failure to achieve at age or grade level. It's actually in the regulation. States can raise the bar, but most don't. The other second thing is that evaluations do not require cognitive assessments. So when you're advocating in your state or for policies, be aware that the federal law does not require cognitive assessments. It's up to you to convince the schools and the districts and the states they need to do it. This is a landmine. That's what we've been talking about. Short-term, be vocal, inform your members of Congress about your experiences and that learning disabilities are real. They're just not underachievement, that they're neurologically based. And the other is to push that your state adopts the LDA methods of evaluation, which are identified in our core principles. I see we also have some questions. So we want to plug our conference coming up. We're actually going to have on the first day an extensive amount of, we have 3 sessions on evaluations that's focused with psychologists. And then we'll have 3 sessions. I'm an attorney, that we've had experts who are lawyers on evaluations and identification, is talking about how to get those evaluations and how to get them read correctly by the school districts so your child is identified and gets services. So if you're going to come. So we'd like to see you there. We think it's important.
Right, registration is open, and we're in the early bird stages of registration, so now's the time to register. Hi, I'm Beth McGaughan. I'm the president of Learning Disabilities Association, and I want to thank Joanna and Monica for doing such a great job today. You shared some very enlightening information with us, and I hope that everybody can walk away understanding that proper documentation for students for SLD students, specific learning disabilities, can open many doors. And I especially love that slide that you had where you laid that out on the different areas that it can open those doors, the IEP 504, college, high stakes testing, and the workplace. That was very, very great. And if you want to know LDA's stance on some of these, you can go onto our website and look at our core principles on what is a learning disability and the other one on evaluation and identification. All very helpful.
Do we want to jump into the questions?
Yeah.
So I want to let everybody know that you can submit your questions in the Q&A, and to raise your hands if you're on the phone, you can press *9. So we do have a few questions, and I guess Erica is in the background, but I have these questions, so I guess I'll ask them.
Well, actually, why don't I'm going to answer some of these.
Why don't I ask the questions?
Okay.
You can.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, people on the phone can't see the questions, so if Beth reads them out loud and then you guys answer it that way, it's also on the replay.
Right. So if students in public schools do not get a full neuropsychological assessment with cognitive and achievement testing, how do they submit for accommodations for ACT? ACT documentation states they need this, and I've been confused on how they would get approved if they only had a 504 plan in place, but never any testing.
Well, that's kind of the point of this whole presentation, that sometimes students don't have the documentation that they need to access those accommodations. So in some cases, parents go out and they seek those evaluations and they pay privately, which means that, you know, people who cannot afford that, their children might go without that. Some schools will do the evaluation if the parent specifically asks, if they make the case that this testing is needed as part of their child's transition plan, because their transition is to college. They might be successful in getting that testing done. But again, this is hit or miss, and that's one of the reasons that we are having this webinar today, and one of the reasons as an organization that we do have serious concerns about RTI-only identification models.
Thank you. The next question is, Nicole asks, where can we find which methods our state uses for evaluation?
Okay, so per the IDEA, every state has to set their criteria, and that should be available to parents, usually on the Department of Education website for their state. If you can't find it, then I would suggest that you find a contact person for whoever is your state director of special education and contact that office at the state level, and you should be able to get that information.
I'd also like to jump in on two things about the ACT. The one is the ACT has something called the certification of eligibility, which the disability service person in your high school will do. I would start with that person. If they have a 504, that would be that coordinator, and ask how they proceed with the ACT. What Monica talked about, the documentation, the ACT may request the underlying documentation and it might not be there, but that's the first place you would start. They do have something called a certification of eligibility form for students in public schools who have IEPs or 504s. The other thing I would suggest about method of state use for evaluation, because it can be hard and kind of dense to get through the state regs, what I tell parents is go to the special ed coordinator at your public school who's intimately familiar with this process. He or she will have a worksheet or an eligibility sheet or something like that that they use to determine whether or not the student has a learning disability. Ask to see that worksheet for a specific learning disability. It will not say at the top of it, RTI, severe discrepancy, but after you've been listening to Monica outline what these are, you'll be able to figure out which one is being used in your state. It will be a state form because the states have to do that.
Great, thank you. So Renee is asking, with the changes in the College Board accommodations, they're now asking if the student is consistently using those specific accommodations that they're applying for. So how do you see the schools assessing this so that they can answer it honestly to get those accommodations?
Right.
So this is something that raises, first off, this is not new. This has been going on forever. My kids went through this process 10 years ago, and this is something that the disability service person had to check off. It's hit or miss with the schools, whether or not they have a system in place to keep track of whether or not your child is using their accommodations. I usually, when my kids were going through, would require that the teacher would ask them at the end of the year to sign a letter to my daughter or to me saying, just want you to know your daughter had extended time and I was the one who saw it and she used it regularly. I'm kind of neurotic because I'm a lawyer, but I'll pass off to Monica, who's been in a school district. Maybe other districts have processes in place to set this.
Well, typically it's kind of what Joanna, you were talking about before, is that there is a documentation that both the College Board and the ACT asks whoever the disability coordinator is. So whoever that person is, and often it's somebody in the high school counseling department, they will sign off, they will sign their name, and they will document where the accommodations for that individual student were documented, either in an IEP or a 504, and they will check off a box that says, yes, these are the accommodations that the student uses, and then they sign their name to that form. So that's typically how that information is collected. And every once in a while, there's some pushback because there may have not have been enough underlying information, and College Board or ACT circles back and asks for more information. But typically, it's just whoever is designated signing off on that.
So we have another question that talks about dysgraphia, saying that their student has gotten accommodations for this, has had a full neurological assessment, but the ACT will only give them extended time for writing, but not for anything else. Do you see any issues with that, or do you know how she might be able to?
It's hard to comment on individual, cases, and if the documentation that was provided showed that the child or the student's impairment was in writing, but that they were able to read, with reasonable fluency, then I could understand why the ACT might be making that decision. But again, it would really be based on what that documentation was provided for in that individual case.
So I'll jump in here because Beth and I have heard people from the College Board and other people talk about this. They are looking in these reports for also a description and explanation of this is quote, the functional limitation, end quote. So the student might have a disorder that impacts maybe one thing, but as a teacher, you see the other, whether it's graphia or reading or stuff. In the report, it has to identify not just the numbers, but say how this results in a functional limitation for this student in this specific test. So I can't speak to specific instances here because obviously we haven't seen it. And as Monica says, it's kind of complicated, but just be aware that, and that's all part of the documentation disconnect. If you don't have a document that explains the functional limitation, you're not getting accommodations.
Wow. So we have one more question that we can take. What needs to be done to make sure a child receives a comprehensive evaluation for a student with learning disabilities in the pre-kindergarten or preschool?
Well, that one's a little bit more difficult because in some states, they don't even use the term learning disabilities in preschool. They'll use developmental delay. So every state has their own guidelines and regulations around early intervention. So you would probably need to reach out to your local school district who would be able to tell you how to access preschool services. And that's pretty much the best that I can answer for this one. It's going to really depend on the state.
And in this case, it does seem to be a specific case. So maybe, Mary, you can email info@ldaamerica.org and we can maybe answer that a little bit more specifically for you. Okay. Well, I want to thank Elizabeth for her comment here that as a college learning specialist who works in a disability services office, I want to thank you for pointing out that students may have trouble with their documentation when they apply for accommodations at college. So Elizabeth is pointing out that, she sees that. And so that's what LDA is trying to do here, is to inform you, and that's what our organization is about, to help advocate for individuals at all levels So again, we hope that you'll join us at our Orlando conference in February. We're going to have a lot of information about what we've just talked about. It's going to extend into what Joanna said. It'll extend into pieces of the law, but we also have information about classroom and many other types of issues that surround learning disabilities. So we really hope you'll join us. The early bird rate is up October 31st. Let's see, I think that's it for now. We want to remind you that we will have a replay of this webinar, and it's going to be sent out tomorrow afternoon to everyone who has registered. So Joanna and Monica, do you have any closing comments?
Thank you all for joining us, and stay tuned. Monica?
Nope. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Yep. And if you have any more questions, again, you can send it to info@ldaamerica.org. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.